bias. And not just from the perspective of, it's something out there, but understanding that we all have unconscious biases. And we all have unconscious biases that in fact may contradict conscious perspectives that we have, right? And so step one is knowing and understanding what unconscious bias is, because it is going to play a role in what we do. And it's just as we have people everywhere in transit, we have unconscious bias everywhere in transit. We have unconscious bias as it pertains to our employees working with other employees. We have unconscious bias as it pertains to our employees working with customers. We have unconscious bias as it pertains to our customers with other customers. So it's unavoidable. And I think it's so important for us to kind of understand that not only is it unavoidable, it is enculturated. It's indoctrinated into our consciousness, and it's not something that we really can stop. What we are going to be talking about today is really understanding what it is and then trying to reduce the impact of it in the decision making in our organizations. And I think that is where there is so much for us to learn and grow on. The other thing that we have to think about is that I think a lot of times when we talk about unconscious bias, we think of it in terms of ethnicity, gender, age, and so forth. But what we don't think about it is in terms of departments, role, title, nationality, job status, union status, et cetera, et cetera. Years ago, when I started on this journey of researching race and ethnicity and understanding inequities in the workplace, I did a study called Target versus Targetto. And people always laugh when I talk about it. And I remember going across the country, looking at the differences in targets across the United States and seeing, were there any differences in how, targets were organized, how customer service was dispensed, especially, et cetera, et cetera. And when I came back, I was so moved by my findings. I remember talking to some of my transit participants about that. And one lady said to me, Dr. Sasha, because everybody calls me Dr. Sasha, we have that in transit. When we look around transit, we have in groups and out groups. We have some communities that are taken care of better than other communities. And yes, we have Title VI. Yes, we have federal laws and so forth and so on. But federal laws cannot stop unconscious bias. It cannot. It can mitigate the impact of it from a decision-making standpoint. But so much of this is not intentional. And that is what we're going to get at. That is what we're going to be talking about in the larger scheme of things. And so we're looking at how does this unconscious bias then translate into stereotypical behavior? How does this unconscious bias then translate into discriminatory behavior? How does this unconscious bias present itself in sexism, in tribalism, in prejudice? And one of the things that we know, and I've been working with transit agencies, as Tenley said, for about 15 years now, almost just shortly after I joined Pacific. And most transit agencies are extremely diverse, right? We have incredibly diverse agencies. And a lot of times when I go in to do these trainings, people would say to me, Dr. Sasha, we don't see color. We treat everyone equal. And Jane Elliott has a wonderful quote that she talks about when she says, I know people say they don't see color, and that probably will explain how you put that top and that bottom together, because we all see color. And it's a little disingenuous to say that we don't see color, but I know the sentiment is we are not trying to be biased. And my response always to that is, this is not about intentional behavior. This is more about how are we unconsciously doing things, and for me to kind of shine a light on our blind spot, so to speak, right? And the other thing that I know is that even though we extremely diverse centers of employment, our diversity is not consistent, right? We have far more diversity in our frontline staff than we have as we go up that hierarchy, as we go up the ladder into our C-suite and so forth and so on. And so we have to think about what is the impact that is happening there as our diversity wanes as we go up that ladder. We also in transit are challenged with our gender equity in particular, right? When we look at what are the numbers of women throughout the organization. In many agencies, women are centered in a lot of administrative roles and not so much in technical fields. And because so much transit is filled with technical roles, we have a deficit of women working, particularly in higher positions. And so we have to think about, and I can testify and tell you, I have spoken to women throughout agencies, and they talk to me about people saying things like, why don't you smile more? Or, you know, not being taken seriously, or walking into a meeting and really having to do a resume demo of why they are here and why they can lead. And so I think this is what we're going to be talking about. And a lot of it is not conscious, right? So here's a quick video. I'm going to have two of them back to back to give a little bit more information about what unconscious bias is, and then particularly talk about things like affinity bias and how that plays a role in decision making. Listen in.
Your brain, by some accounts, receives roughly 11 million pieces of information each second, but your conscious brain is only able to process about 40. How do you handle all the rest? You handle it because you're really using two brains. Your conscious brain, which works with facts and data, has very little capacity and processes information slowly, and your unconscious brain, which is habit and intuition driven, has huge capacity and is really fast. One of your unconscious brain's best tricks is its ability to recognize patterns and use them to assign people and things to categories, allowing your unconscious brain to deal with all of the known, not dangerous issues, and leave only the few unknown or dangerous issues to your conscious brain. This allows us to recognize a pattern and act on it, rather than having to think about every interaction as if we were experiencing it for the first time. We can glance at that four-legged animal and know if it's a wolf or a cocker spaniel. That recognition allows us to make assumptions about the animal facing us, that the wolf belongs to the wild animal category and is likely to be dangerous, or that the cocker spaniel is in the domestic dog category and not likely to be dangerous. The assumptions we make about these pattern groups are likely to be based on our own experiences, on information we have gained from our culture or background, or from the media we listen to or people we admire. Unfortunately, those assumptions are often wrong. When we categorize people, our brains apply two other tools. One is affinity bias, a hardwired preference to respond positively to people who look, sound, and act like ourselves. Brain imaging scans show that when people are shown images of faces that differ from their own, it activates in milliseconds activity in the part of the unconscious brain that alerts us to possible danger. This may reflect a survival tool left over from ancient times when danger often came from those outside our immediate group. Today, however, this means the associations and biases are likely to be unconsciously activated every time when we come across a member of a group, even if we consciously reject group stereotypes. In addition to affinity bias, our unconscious brain categorizes people into groups and then connects those groups to our learned ideas or constructs about what is good or bad. Now, we've decided whether someone is like us or not, and whether they're good or not, all within milliseconds of meeting them. So, what can you do to manage your unconscious biases? You've already started by just learning about unconscious bias. Now, identify your own biases and address one at a time by building inclusive habits. Remember, if you do not intentionally, deliberately, and proactively include, you will unintentionally exclude.
Here's the second one.
New research from the fields of neuroscience and social psychology has shed light onto the concept of unconscious bias. But what exactly is unconscious bias, and how does it affect our behaviors and decisions? Unconscious biases are simply our unintended people preferences. They are formed by our socialization, our personal experiences, and the representations of different groups in the media. These experiences act as social filters in which we make assessments and judgments of people around us. Research tells us that human beings have a natural tendency to place individuals into social categories. These categories are often based on visual cues such as gender, cultural background, age, height, or body size. We also categorize based on social background, job roles, religious identity, or political affiliation. The unconscious brain uses associations based on social categories to develop biases. For example, if we are constantly exposed to women as primary school teachers or receptionists, or men as plumbers and organizational leaders, these associations become wired within the human brain. The unconscious brain uses social categories to make unconscious judgments about people who are similar to us and people who are different from us. A common form of unconscious bias is affinity bias. This type of bias impacts talent processes in organizational decision-making, including how we recruit. Managers are more likely to hire people who look similar or with sounding names to them. Work allocation. Managers are more likely to assign key client projects to individuals within their teams who they have an unconscious affinity with. Performance. Where there is some kind of affinity, managers are more likely to spend time informally discussing positive contributions to the team and will focus on development and future work plans. For those where there is little affinity, managers are more likely to question past performance. The conversation will be less friendly and even hostile at times. Unconscious bias often results in a set of micro-behaviors. Examples of positive micro-behaviors include supporting the ideas of someone with who you have an unconscious affinity whilst in a team meeting, or simply wanting to have coffee with someone like you. Examples of negative micro-behaviors include checking emails on your phone whilst talking to a colleague, or cutting someone off in a meeting. Often our intention is not to make biased decisions, and through a focus on conscious thinking, and by creating inclusive work cultures, we can learn to control our unconscious judgments and mitigate the impact of bias on our talent programs. For more information on the nature of unconscious bias and how to mitigate its effects, contact ENEI.
So, I think the last comment of the first video said,
Jay, may I help you?
if we are not intentional about dealing with unconscious bias, then we will kind of reap the unintended effects of it. And I think that is so important. There are 150 types of biases, guys. There's no shortage of bias. We're all biased in some way, form, or fashion. And I think step one is recognizing that it does exist and recognizing the extent to which it affects us. One of the quotes that I heard was that our decision making is alarmingly contaminated by biases. And it's something that really stuck with me because I think a lot of us will not admit to that. And yet the research on this is crystal clear. Study after study, industry after industry, where people will tell you, I am not a biased person. I don't make bias. And yet when we look at certain circumstances, it is clear bias is playing a role. So I think it's so important for us to begin having this conversation and looking at things like affinity bias, right? Where when we're talking about affinity bias, we're looking at a preference that we show for people who are similar to us because we find it easier to have a conversation with them, easier to relate to someone who we are familiar with. Then there's attribution bias, where we tend to attribute our own successes to our skills. And then we attribute our failures to factors outside of our control. What I always say is, if I am teaching with my students, I say to them, I know if you do well in this class, it's your hard work. But if you do poorly, then it's because I'm not a good teacher, right? So we see the success of others as luck, and we attribute failure to the lack of their ability. I've had several African-American colleagues over the years that have pointed out this kind of research to me. And I found a study that says many times African-Americans perceive the situation that they are given opportunities based on past experience, whereas several of their white colleagues may be given opportunities based on potential. And the research backs that up very, very clearly. There's a ton of research. I know the NAACP did a study where they sent out resumes and then they followed that up with interviews. So there have been a number of studies with resumes, and without a doubt, almost, to a T, resumes with African-American sounding names are not treated in the same way that resumes with white sounding names are treated. It is tons of research on this. But the NAACP research, they had applicants, they had white applicants and Black applicants with the exact same resume. And almost 9 times out of 10, the white applicant was chosen over the Black applicant. And when they had them show up in person, they intentionally had the white applicant show up late, be intentionally rude. And still, even with that, we had situations where the majority of time, hands down, the white applicant was able to get the job. So this is speaking to affinity bias. This is speaking to all of these unconscious biases we may or may not be aware of. Then there's confirmation bias, right? Where we have this initial opinion of someone and we are constantly looking for evidence to back up that initial opinion, as opposed to kind of overlooking information that would contradict that point of view. We're not listening to that perspective. We also have conformity bias, where we tend to take cues from others to arrive at our decision rather than exercise our own independent judgment. And this is particularly concerning in a hierarchical environment, right? And of course, transit tends to have a strong hierarchy kind of management style. And so we have to recognize that bias is everywhere. There's no shortage of it. And why would that play a role? Now, if we were homogenous as agencies, then bias would still be there, because just because we are similar doesn't mean that we won't find a way to highlight the small differences that we do have. But we know when we have diverse work sets, as we do in transit, then this issue of unconscious bias is even more concerning. And then the data tells us that we really do want to have a diverse set of employees, because companies, data tells us, companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns that is above the industry average. And when we talk about just gender diversity on its own, 15%. And of course, in California, we know that we are now going to see a lot of studies as a result of the law that is requiring certain amount of board composition to have women on them. But a lot of times I hear managers talk about friction. Diversity can cause friction. I teach several classes about age diversity, and it is a mess, right? The boomers are doing one thing, the millennials are doing another thing. We have the Zers that are in here to upset the whole apple cart, and day in, day out, my exes, that's my generation, are pulling our hair out. And that's just age diversity, right? So we know friction is an issue, but even with the friction, it's in our best interest to have diverse teams, because results are boosted by 60%. So that is saying, even if there's going to be a little pain, but boy, is there a lot of gain, right? And so one of the other things we know that, in addition to looking at this increase in results, we have found that there is also a real challenge when you have a non-diverse team coming up with solutions for a very diverse team to execute. And remember, we talked about the fact that a lot of our frontline staff groups are far more diverse than our senior execs. So that is something that we have to consider. We also know that, when we have more women on board, that there's less volatility and risk factors are improved. So there's a lot of data and research to back up why we need to have this diverse group, and how unconscious bias, because of the diverse group, is going to play a role. Okay, so I have an exercise for you. And if you've seen this before, don't say the answer, right? But I want you all to think about it. I'm going to read and you tell me what's happening. A father and son were involved in a car accident in which the father was killed and the son was seriously injured. The father was pronounced dead at the scene of the accident, and his body was taken to a local morgue. The son was taken by ambulance to a nearby hospital and was immediately wheeled into an emergency operating room. A surgeon was called. Upon arrival and seeing the patient, the attending surgeon exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's my son. Can you explain this?" Now I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think through what exactly is happening here. And then I'm going to unpack it a little bit. So I'm putting on my timer, just 10 seconds. I'm going to give folks to think about this. Okay, so let's unpack what's happening here. It's the mother. The mother is the surgeon that was called. And a lot of times you cannot even imagine some of the mental somersaults people do in order to make it work for a man. So often folks will say to me, "Oh, Dr. Sasha, we were, that's stereotypical to think it was a woman. Is that a traditional family?" And we thought it was a same-sex couple. And I said, okay, but the reason that you came to the conclusion that it was a same-sex couple is because you were so tied to the notion that the surgeon had to be a man. And therefore, since the surgeon is a man, it must be a same-sex couple. So even that has some unconscious bias. So sometimes people will say to me things like, "Oh, well, we thought about maybe it's a theoretical father, like a priest, and not the real father," again, because we tied to the idea that the surgeon was a man. So many different sentiments. People say, "Well, what if you just call this person dad and it wasn't a real dad?" Again, tied to the notion. And you would be amazed at how many people who are married to a female physician still don't think of it. And it all has to do with this idea that we are all biased. We have deep-seated biases that are reinforced daily by what we hear, what we see on TV, what we listen to on the radio, what we open up in magazines. And this is very important. It is possible for us to hold unconscious stereotypes that we consciously oppose. And I often give the example of, taking a flight, because I travel so much for work, taking a flight to China to do a lecture in China and seeing a female pilot and being so ecstatic and thinking, "Oh, I wish all my pilots were female. This is fabulous." Getting on that plane and the first sign of turbulence, me saying, "Oh, wait, how many flight hours has she lodged? Like, is this, is she really good?" Because even though consciously I would identify probably as a feminist, I live in a male-dominated world. So I still have all of these unconscious biases, even though they are consciously what I oppose. And so I have to ask you guys, what is your bias? And we're going to do a quick exercise, just 5-10 minutes, where we're going to put you guys into breakout rooms, and we are going to ask you to discuss what stereotypes are you seeing playing out in your offices, playing out in your boardrooms, playing out with employees, and playing out with customers. 10 minutes. So I think Tenley is I'm going to stop sharing. Tenley is going to put us into breakout rooms and open them up, and then you can go ahead and join your room. Tenley, do we have everyone back?
No, we have about 30 seconds. People are joining as we speak, so.
Okay. Let me know when we have everyone. Wait, hang on. Let me know when we have everyone back. Okay. I'm going to.
In about 5 seconds here, we should get everyone back in.
Okay.
As you look at the structures.
Micah, we brought you back. I think you might have been talking while were you mid-sentence before when we brought you back?
I was finalizing my sentence, so we're going to proceed. Thank you so much, Dr. Sasha.
Okay, all right, cool. All right, Tenley, I think we have everybody back now.
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. All right, so hopefully those little conversations were productive. What I heard in some of the rooms that I joined was a lot of women kind of talking about the fact that we have some work to do in transit. I was sharing with one group that I had one woman tell me that her first day of work, somebody asked her, so who did you have to sleep with to get the job? And I just was blown away by that. And she said, and no one even bat an eye when they said that to her. This is a pretty senior person at an agency. So I think it's so important for us to think about, what diversity looks like and how we are going to be able to maximize our diversity in all of our agencies. And whether we like it or not, it's here, diversity is here to stay, right? California right now is the second most diverse state in the union. Hawaii is ahead of us. But the idea is that by 2050, America is going to be majority brown, but California is going to get there before. And so by 2040, we're going to move from about 37 million up to almost 50 million folks. And most of that growth is happening in LA County and in the Bay Area. And what that means is some of our biggest transit agencies, we're talking about Access, we're talking about LA Metro, we're talking about BART, we're talking about Muni, AC Transit. We have so many agencies that are going to be impacted by this growth. And so we have to think about how are we going to deal with unconscious bias as we have more and more diverse work groups. And I just wanted to read this out because I found this little scenario, and it really was such an indication of where we were versus where we're going to be. So they're talking about hiring in a marketing firm. Of course, I'm partial to marketing as a marketer myself, but I thought it was very relevant to transit. In 1955, the firm had just hired 3 new employees who would join a product marketing group to handle the growth of new business brought on by the baby boom. The department was headed by a manager, a 35-year-old white male with a college degree, who had been with the firm since joining the company after serving with the Navy in the Second World War. The current group has 4 members, all white males ranging from 25 to 35. All joined the company with the intent of making a career within the firm. 3 of the 4 had college degrees and 2 of them served in the military. 1 of them first generation Italian. The 3 new members are also white males. 1 of them has a college degree. 2 served in the military during the Korean conflict, and 1 is an immigrant from Europe. In 2005, the firm again hires 3 new employees to join the product marketing team. Now, because of the expansion of the in the Southwest of the Hispanic population, the team is now headed by a 28-year-old female with an MBA who joined the firm 2 years ago after a successful stint in an advertising firm. The current cross-functional team has 4 members, 2 women, 2 men. 2 women are Asian and Hispanic, one a first-generation Chinese with a degree in marketing, the other an immigrant from Mexico with a degree in Chicano studies. One of the 2 males has a junior college degree, the other has a GED high school diploma. One is a 49-year-old Black man with extensive career experience in radio and TV advertising and was a military veteran from Vietnam. The other is a 24-year-old white male who's gay. None of the team have been with the firm more than 5 years. Folks, this is transit. This is transit. We have so much diversity, and we have so much diversity on all these things. But particularly, we also have to think about how unconscious bias is presented itself in department diversity, is presenting itself in authority diversity, in hierarchy diversity. So many times folks talk to me about how people who were promoted by being with the company a long time, how they are treated versus newcomers, or union versus non-union, managerial staff versus non-managerial staff. And I think we just don't think about biases within the ranks like this. And so and the other thing that we don't think about is policies, procedures, and how these policies and procedures, even though on paper people may say, but it's just fair. It's our policy. It doesn't take a Black lens, a white lens, a Chicano lens. It doesn't take a Hispanic lens or Asian lens. It's not about gay or straight, but people are enacting these policies. And so as a result, they are going to lend themselves to be just in the nature, they are going to lend themselves to be biased. And so I wanted to take a look at this video because it talks about the potential for there to be some kind of bias. Here we go.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? This is a nice day today. They're just chatting up. And says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been, she goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So for me, that video is so powerful because I think if we unpack that a little bit, we are looking at the checker. There are a couple of things that's going on. First of all, there's this issue of nonverbal cues and verbal cues. So, Joy DeGruy is a well-known speaker in the area of unconscious bias, race dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. And so she's talking about, first of all, as she comes up, she notices there is a not chit chat, right? So there's an immediate verbal and physical almost reaction to the fact that she's not similar. She's not familiar. She picks it up. Her daughter picks it up. right? That's the first thing. Second, there's nonverbal cues. So she is looking up, the checker is a little bit uncomfortable. She doesn't make the same kind of eye contact. It's a little bit different, right? And so immediately there is that. There is this idea that, okay, something is a little bit different. I just saw the dynamic of what was happening with my sister-in-law. I am not being treated that way. I'm not going crazy. I know I am not being treated that way. Okay. And then here comes the policy. Now, this is something that I found when I was talking about Tarjay versus Targetto. The policy doesn't change from the hood to the good. It doesn't. What changes is how we apply the policy, right? And so the idea is that here, this is the same policy, except that with Kathleen, the sister-in-law, the perceived white sister-in-law, there is no checking of the ID. There is no checking in the bad checkbook. So the policy is the same, but it is applied differently. And this is as a result of unconscious bias. Now, if we didn't have a camera there, or if we didn't have Joy narrating the situation, I can guarantee you, if this had played out and we spoke to the cashier after and we said, did you know that your unconscious bias was just playing a role? She said, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was doing the right thing. I was following the policy. She would not even have been aware that she didn't follow the policy for the lady ahead. You see her immediate response was, oh, but I know you. And Kathleen's response was, no, you don't. If you know anybody, you should know Joy, because Joy has one here, been living multiple years. And so when we don't see color, I am here to tell you we do. We see it. And not only do we see differences, but we do treat people differently. I was having this conversation with Tenley and Michael yesterday when we did a dry run, and saying only about 15% of all of the United States population are over 6 feet, about 15%. But when we look at CEOs, over 40% of CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Now, I don't know what that is about, but it's telling me there's some kind of bias playing a role somewhere in there, where we know from the research taller people are favored. People that are perceived attractive are given opportunities. People that are perceived unattractive are not. Tall people versus short people. Attractive versus unattractive. We discriminate, and that is a fact. So I think the unfortunate thing, though, is that we have this notion in our minds that you're a bad person if you have these biases, and that you're immoral and evil and all these negative connotations, so that people don't want to look into the possibility that they do have these biases. And I say it's not a good thing or a bad thing to have a bias. It's just a thing. It's a human thing. What can be negative is how we act on these biases. And that's what we are really trying to really get at today and get to the bottom of. And so, for me, I think it's hard for us to hear. It's hard for us to believe. There is so much research to back up what I'm telling you about. And not only that, I think we have to look at what is actually happening. We have to listen to employees and not be afraid of putting different groups together so that we get different perspectives. I remember I was in Southern California doing a talk, and I remember talking to a group about how different perspectives play a role in our day-to-day job functions. And my dad was a bus driver for almost 15 years. And I remember him always complaining about planners, right? And every time I bring up this story, all the drivers always smile and the planners frown. But the idea is, my dad will always say, who came up with this route? Who was the person that calculated this route, and what is the perspective they were coming from? He said, because if there was a driver in the room, this wouldn't happen. And I remember having this conversation in LA and talking to some folks, and several agencies would plan routes without drivers being present in the room to discuss it. And then one agency said, you know what? We're going to take your feedback, and we're going to do some changes. We're going to commit to having drivers in the room when we do our planning. And they came back the next time I was in LA to do a talk, and they said to me, Sasha, you have no idea how you've changed this agency, because now that we have drivers in the room, we have two things happening that we didn't anticipate. One, drivers come with such a unique perspective to that conversation that the process is so improved for having a diverse perspective, a perspective that wasn't there before. We are able to do things and see things and consider things we just didn't consider before. But the other result that was really what was game changer was now when a driver comes into the locker room or to the break room and says, I don't know who came up with this route, I don't know what they were thinking, there is another driver who can say, well, here's what went into this decision making that you probably were not privy to. Here's why we did this, here's why we did that. And so having that different perspective in the room really paid tremendous dividends to the organization. And it allowed them to absorb so many perspectives that proved to be very useful to the organization. Because I can tell you that there are so many folks who are in the room who have something to add, but don't feel empowered enough to be able to add it. And I heard one lady, I was listening to this talk, and she talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and diversity being invited to the dance, right? Inclusion being asked to dance at the dance. And I would say belonging is when they play your song, when they play your jam, right? And I think bringing people to the table is one thing, but I think we have to think about how are we playing people's jams, right? How are we looking at the decision-making process and figuring out where these biases are playing a role in our procedures, where they are playing a role in our processes, and how that is panning out for our businesses, for our agencies. And so how are our biases affecting our decision making? How are our biases affecting our procedures? How are our biases affecting our processes? Now I'm going to open up our breakout rooms again, and I'm just going to, this again, 10 minutes, and I want you all to talk about decision making, procedures, processes. How are our biases maybe affecting those components? So we're going to stop sharing again. This is going to be another short one, 10 minutes. We're going to be in the room, and then we come back and we're going to wrap up, and we're going to have a question and answer where we can talk about some of the things that maybe came up in our breakout rooms. So Tandy, why don't we go ahead and open up the rooms and have people talk about these conversations about how decision-making in particular is maybe impacted by biases, but also what is the procedure? How is the process affected by biases as well? So I just wanted to, again, welcome everyone back, because I think everyone is back. And one thing that came up as I went around the groups is, someone said, we don't think about pronouns. And maybe as we are doing introductions, or as people are, we are doing orientations, we should probably ask people, what is their preferred pronoun? And I can tell you again, and we were just having a discussion, this is something that comes up when I'm doing intergenerational training. And so I started off doing intergenerational training with boomers, right? Trying to explain to them why their head is exploding when they have to deal with these millennials, right? And coaching the boomers and holding their hands straight and say, it's going to be okay. And before they give you a heart attack, you're going to be retired. So don't worry about it, right? But then I had to actually start doing training for millennials because boomers were driving them crazy, right? And one of the things that I found is this idea of a new normal. And so for my Zias and a lot of my millennials, pronouns is standard operating procedure, right? Standard operating procedure. But me trying to walk my mom through, non-binary, it's not easy. So I understand that this is challenging. This is going to be challenging for some staff, but we have to recognize the impact this can have on our employees and our customers. And we were talking, I think I was speaking with Shelly and Lisa, talking about, when we say good morning on the bus or the train, maybe instead of saying good morning, sir or ma'am, we train people to just say good morning, how are you doing, right? Without assigning someone a particular gender by our greeting. And so we have to, it's different for a lot of people. We're like, oh my goodness, this is a whole new world. And it is. But we do have to think about on our forms in HR, do we have male, female, non-binary? Little things like that we have to think about in our decision making. How do we, and our processes and our procedures, how do we treat everyone fairly? I remember the first time that I had a visually impaired student in my class. And I just really had to think about, he was super techie. So he had every single device. And it was so easy with him because I didn't have to change PowerPoints. He had them translated into Braille. But I remember asking him, how do they deal with visuals? So you can change all the wording, but how are you dealing with visuals? And he's like, they don't translate visuals. And so I had to adjust if I would show a picture, I would take time and energy to describe the picture. And I think this is what I really want us to think about as we think about decision-making, procedures, processes, how it impacts the minority as well as the majority. And whoever or however we do that and look at that, what that minority and majority means, I want us to think about that. So the next step before we break out into questions where, you guys ask me questions and I try to answer it to the best of my ability, we're going to talk about next steps. And I want to introduce you guys to this idea of implicit bias testing. And so Harvard runs this site where they allow people to almost measure your implicit bias. And we've been talking for the last hour or so about, how this is an unconscious sentiment that we have, how this is not a conscious sentiment that we have, and how this may go in the face of things that we are so actively trying to go against. You cannot find a doctor that will say, yes, I am prejudiced. Yes, I treat my patients differently. And yet the data is so clear that doctors prescribe pain medicine very differently for Black versus white patients. A ton of data. You're not going to find a real estate agent or evaluator, an appraiser who says, yeah, I give, my Black clients a totally different, and my Latinx clients a totally different appraisal of their houses versus white clients. No one is going to say that, but yet it happens all the time. So we have a ton of data on this, on studies, and Harvard came up with this implicit bias test where you could go in to test your unconscious biases. And some people are gonna have problems and say, oh, it's something's wrong with the test. Some people are going to say, oh, I don't even know if the results are accurate. These are smart people who did this, right? Who came up with this. And again, this is not looking at something conscious, it's looking at something unconscious. And they have all different types of bias testing. They are on body size, on race, ethnicity, age, guns, all kinds of different ones. And I would encourage people to go in and do some testing. And then if you're open to it, we can discuss it when we come back next week. Totally, again, voluntary. But I'm going to play a little video to explain what the implicit bias test is all about.
Our problem is that the new American dilemma isn't so simple. We have all of these markers by which we can demonstrate that we're not the people we used to be. But we don't know the ways in which we're not such good people because that part is unconscious. You may think this about yourself, but is that really who you are? We actually created a test that measures bias. You see words that capture good and bad. You have to associate Yankees with good and Red Sox with bad. This is very easy for a Yankee fan. But when you tell them to associate Yankee with bad and Red Sox with good, that's an impossible thing for them to do. They can't do it. They'll make mistakes. They'll take a lot longer to do it, and so on. Take a test like this and now just replace Red Sox and Yankees with the groups black and white. Imagine that for half the trials on this test, you have to associate black with good whenever you see a black face or a word like love, peace, joy, friend, all these good things. And while you're doing that, you have to put white and bad together. And words that mean terrible things in the world, words like agony, devil, bomb, vomit. How hard is that for you to do, is the question. We're not talking about your conscious attitudes. We're not talking about your conscious beliefs. We're talking about something that you yourself may not necessarily know you have. For something like 75% of white Americans, it's very hard to put black and good together.
So this is the Harvard implicit bias test. And I would encourage everyone to go look at it, do it if you feel, but it is going to tell you, and you might be surprised or you may not be. So we have talked about a lot of things, right? And this session really was meant to kind of shine a light for you guys to think about how have you been raised? Who are your friends? What kinds of communities you live? How are you exposing yourself to things that you are unfamiliar with? And I can tell you that, it has nothing to do, in a lot of instances, in almost all instances, you don't choose to be exposed to certain things. You were just exposed, particularly as you were growing up. And these things have almost kind of imprinted on your brain so that you have this particular perspective. And how do you rewire your brain? By exposure to new things and new people. And so I think that's so important for us to recognize that we have to expose ourselves to new people and new things and new dynamics in order to rewire our brain. And I also want us to consider, because a lot of times we think about, okay, how people are negatively impacted by biases. So we talk a lot about unearned disadvantages, right? So what is the impact my color is playing? How does, my race and ethnicity impact the opportunities I get? How people perceive me, what I do in a negative way. But what we don't really talk about as much is how biases can lead to advantages that are not earned. So we know about disadvantages that are not earned, but what about advantages that are not earned? What are the advantages we are getting, the benefits of the doubt that people are giving us? I have so many stories that I could tell. We don't even have time for it, about, how people interact with me once they find out I'm a professor versus how they interacted with me before they knew that I was a professor, right? Just by finding out that I have a doctor in front or a PhD at the end, how that affects how people speak to me, how they interact with me, whether they smile or not smile, give me deference or don't. That is happening on a macro and micro level in so many different situations. And I think that is something that we have to think about, be aware of, and be reflective on how that is impacting our lives at work, at home, at play, and how we can stop these cycles where there's a negative impact. How we can make sure that people know about unconscious bias, and that unconscious bias is limited in terms of its impact in our boardrooms, in our offices, in our transit vehicles, because there are a lot of unconscious biases, right? 150 of them, there's no shortage. So we really have to think about what are we doing to shine a light on this problem, and how are we supporting our employees, our staff, our clients and customers as we move towards mitigating the impacts of unconscious bias. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to open up the floor for questions, because I would anticipate people have a lot of questions, but maybe not, right? Maybe people are like, okay, Sasha, you've covered it all. We don't have any questions, but hopefully there are some questions. And Tenley, here we go. Yeah, and so Jacqueline is saying you can chat, you can type them in the chat. I'm seeing some faces that I have met on many occasions in the past, a lot of people on the call. So you guys tell me what questions you have. And if you want, Jackie is also saying you can raise your hand and go ahead and unmute if you have questions. Come on, people, don't be shy. We are very excited to engage with everyone. As you all know, I teach in transit agencies across the states. I think I've met at least one person from every transit agency in the state of California in the 15 years that I've been working with transit agencies. So I'm seeing a ton of people that I know on the call. Don't make me call some of you all and say, come up with a question. What are the questions? Are you all going to really Zoom silence me? No questions? Tenley, Jacqueline, Michael, anybody wants to start us off with questions of your own? Oh, here we go. Jim has raised his hand.
Hi, I'm on the Golden Gate Bridge Board, and it occurred to me listening to you, I wonder how many other agencies might have staff or public actually on the board, and if so, what kind of impact that may make on their decision-making process.
When you say
and the decisions they make.
When you say, like, if they have members riders on the board themselves.
Riders or public, yes, and
Right.
and potentially staff. You know, in one of the breakout rooms, we were talking about the difference it makes when you get somebody who, you know, a driver. Well, you mentioned it also. You know, helping make decisions on the routes. Well, making decisions on a higher level at the board level. You know, what kind of an impact and difference might those decisions be if the board had, you know, potentially a more diverse, I guess you'd say, board.
Right. Well, I can tell you, having worked with some boards, some agencies, some of these larger boards, that when we have folks who actively take public transit, you see a clear difference versus folks on the board who have never taken public transit. And transit, not only boards, but employees in California is really interesting, because I always talk about the fact that most of our agencies have a majority of workers who do not take public transit, right? Which is pretty unique, I would say, because you're not going to go to Apple and find out that everyone has a Samsung phone, right? I always use that as the example, right? And so if everyone at Apple had a Samsung phone, it would make it harder to figure out solutions for Apple users, since none of them were. And I think that is something really unique about transit, where we have a ton of employees who are working in this sector and not taking public transportation. And I think that must and will impact the decision making. And so because of that, I think there's a stronger impetus and a stronger need for us to ensure that we understand the perspectives of the public, that we really seek out their feedback. And I have heard employee after employee kind of lament about the fact that their board maybe reactive because they don't consider something until there are complaints state and so forth and so on. And I think part of that is because we do need more diversity on our boards, and we do need boards that are more representative of wider cross sections of people who are in transit. And I think it's all a work in progress, right? And I think the boards across the state do have their customers' best interests at hand. But we know for a fact that the more diversity we have and the more we have a wide range of perspectives, is the better we're able to come up with solutions that consider everyone, right?
Yeah.
And we know that for a fact.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
And we have a question. So how do you hold your team accountable for unconscious biases that are apparent to others on the team?
That's a hard one, right? Because a lot of folks, well, first of all, we don't talk about this. So I would say we have to have a culture, we have to set up a culture where we speak about this. And what I have found, a lot of managers that I have spoken to have said to me, modeling the behavior and mirroring the behavior that they would like to see in others is a first step in the right direction, where you have a senior team member, a manager or a floor worker, whoever, who is very inclusive in how they address others. They give people equal opportunity at meetings to speak. They consider people's pronouns when they are speaking to them. They make an effort to be visually, openly inclusive and to not tolerate a lack of where people demonstrate very clear, non-inclusive behaviors. And so I find like that is a first step where when people see that happening, two things happen. The bad actors recognize this is not a place where I want to demonstrate these behaviors. And then the folks that are impacted by non-inclusive behaviors feel as if they have agency to speak up and to state. And I want to, this is an opportunity for me to make a little point here, because this is something I've spoken to so many employees about. This idea of not only having unconscious bias, but being at the receiving end of unconscious bias throughout your life, because it must then impact how you respond, when you respond, etc. I'll give you an example. So if I have a situation where I'm driving down the road and I get cut off by somebody, I'm going to be like, hey, what's up, right? It's the first person for the day. I'm still in a good mood. I just had my coffee. But what if it happens over and over and over and over? And by the 14th person, what I want a big truck and a helmet, right? So I have to just ram people. and that 14th person, however, is like, is it that serious? Like, I didn't mean to cut you off. Like, I'm not a serial cut offer, right? And so I think we often don't realize that 14th person, you may be the first person that they're cutting off today, but if you are the recipient of being cut off 14 times, you don't have the energy, the temperament, the patience for somebody doing this to you 14 times. And I think that for me is so important for us to recognize, because a lot of times I would hear people say, well, I didn't realize this person was so sensitive, or I think they're having an overreaction. And I would say that I don't think it's an overreaction, because if you've been going over this and having this experience time and time again, and with a feeling like no one's hearing you, no one's interested, no one's bothered, no one's concerned, you may have a volatile reaction. So I would say that it has to be something that you get in the practice of being open about and bringing up and discussing. And at the beginning, I'm going to see people say, and people have asked me, like, people will say, Dr. Sasha, why don't you use the term Hispanic? And I would say, because there are a lot of derogatory origins of the word Hispanic, and a lot of people don't know that. So I try to use Latinx, and ever so often I'm going to fall by the wayside and use the wrong term, but that is what I'm going to try to do. And so my students would hear me and they would open up a conversation. And then, the first time we started having conversations about non-binary and how students want to be referred to, students will come to me. Of course, I am a Black woman with red hair and a nose ring, and that helps. But the idea is that because they feel the energy that I give off, they know, one, I'm not tolerating a non-inclusive comment, a non-inclusive environment. And so that makes them feel comfortable. And also, they know I'm trying and that I want to do the right thing. And so that helps all of us recognize this is not about blame, because a lot of times people are not necessarily doing it in a negative way. It's just maybe how they were raised, or maybe they don't even recognize, or maybe this is something difficult and hard for them. And so we need to give people a little bit grace. And I would say how we address it, we have to be as open and as inclusive in how we address it. And so we might just, you know, like I was in a room one time and I heard somebody talking about Oriental, and they were referring to an individual, and I just looked over and I said, I think you meant to say Asian, because I don't think that we speak about other human beings in that way. I think we talk about rugs and lamps in that way, but not humans. And I just, you know, I wasn't mean-spirited. I didn't make a big issue out of it. It needed to be addressed, however. And so I think it is important for us to address things and be as open about it as possible. So we have less, let me call you into this little meeting and talk about this, and just, you know, talk about it in general terms in the beginning until we see that it really is a problem. And then people need to be trained and it needs to be discussed, because I tell you, there are marginalized communities across agencies that feel as if they have no voice, no one is interested, no one cares. And I don't think that is the case. I just think we don't recognize how deep some of these waters run. I hope that that has kind of answered what you were talking about, Karen.
Karen, if you want to chat or raise your hand, you can. But to follow up on that, Sasha, just real quick, is what kind of training or what can we do in the workplace to encourage the employees to speak up and feel comfortable speaking up, that it's okay, that they're safe to do that, to talk about the things that you talked about?
Well, I would say, Jacqueline, few agencies have even considered having unconscious bias training. So most people do not even know what it is. And I've now started having a segment in all of my trainings about unconscious bias. And I cannot tell you how many of those segments people start off, well, we don't have a problem here because we have Title VI. Like we that's not a thing here. We're not biased. We're all equal, right? So I think the first thing is that you have to have training on what is unconscious bias, how pervasive it is, how it shows up in our decision making, why we have to think about it, and why it's important for us to have these conversations. That's the first step. We have to have these conversations, because we're not moving widgets, we're moving people. And as we open up and California becomes more diverse and we have more diverse groups of people working together, we're going to have more friction. But if we understand, wow, that's like my unconscious bias playing a role there, I gotta check that, then that helps, because it puts us in this framework that we're not good or bad or whatever. We have bias. So I would encourage all agencies, just like, you know, let's think of it this way. We get what we reward. We count what we consider important. And so are we doing training around this? Do we have you know, KPIs around unconscious bias and how we treat people? And most agencies probably don't. And so it is a conversation that we have to have. And some agencies, what they're starting to do is they have like, I wouldn't want to say an advocate, but maybe someone in every department that has been designated as the person you can come to and you can talk about these experiences that you're having, and that person can be a sounding board. And then that person is going to take it to management and say, hey, this is what I'm hearing from my colleagues. These are some topics that have come up. We need to talk about it. So some agencies are handling it like that. Some agencies have done a number of trainings at BART, at Access, you know, and so some agencies are openly, BART has really committed and is out in the forefront to training all of their staff on different aspects of unconscious bias. So I think that, you know, different agencies are taking it in stride in different ways. But certainly there has to be a conversation about training, and there has to be a conversation about, are we going to have someone that you can speak to? Because it might be, you know, sometimes people say, well, you can go to your manager. What if your manager is the problem, right? So designate, and often that person who's been designated as the diversity advocate or the diversity rep or DEI person, that person wanted to have that role, because sometimes there's one person of color or one person who you know may identify in a minority group, and all of a sudden they're designated as a DEI person and they didn't want that. So I think we have to be considerate as well of that. I don't know if that does that cover it, Jackie?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Anybody want to share maybe some of the things they've done in their agency to help combat biases, unconscious biases specifically, and other questions?
And I can tell you that, you know, Jackie, one of the things in doing some of the training in these agencies, I have found is that a lot of people come to the training very doubtful, very kind of skeptical, and leave it saying, wow, like I had no idea. And particularly after people do the IAT, the implicit associative bias test, then they really start recognizing, wow, this river runs a little deep. I had no idea. And they recognize how bias is playing a role in their lives. And so I think often it's just starting the conversation, right? And that starting of the conversation sometimes is mandatory, sometimes it's voluntary. But a lot of people had no idea that this is a thing, that this exists. Or they think, oh, it's a figment of imagination. But when I show the videos about how our brain works and the fact that our brain, we get 40 million bits of information, you know, every second, and we can only, what is it? 11 million bits of information, and our brain can only process 40. So unconsciously, we're doing a lot of screening. And so when I tell them these things and people start really being open and recognizing, wow, like we want to hear more. We want to know more about this.
Thank you. And Michael has a question. Michael?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sasha, for the time this afternoon. And I just want to probe one question, one thought that you put on the table just now in your response to both Karen and Jackie, related to the identification of someone who can serve as a champion and serve as that voice, takes in feedback as they hear about microaggressions that happen in the office, who can stand up for voices and show that there is a safe space. And one of the challenges I've often found in organizations and classrooms is that oftentimes that weight falls to folks that belong to minority groups, whether it's a woman or a person of color. And frankly, it's not their job to be leading these conversations, driving change within their organizations exclusively. And so I guess my question to you is, how do we formalize this in a way that respects that divide and the fact that not every person of color, not every woman is going to want to step into that role, while still providing an opportunity for the organization to identify a champion who's going to want to stand up and be that voice and be that listener for folks who find themselves facing any form of threat or harassment in the office?
That is a great question. And I can tell you, when I came to the US, I had no idea I was going to be an activist, right? For my entire career, I've been one of one. When I was in grad school, I was the only Black in my PhD program of my year. I was the only woman. I was the only international. I was the only. And even still at the business school, I'm the only Black professor. And I can tell you, I often say to people, if something on diversity comes up, even before I was a dean, everybody would take a quick, Sasha, what do you think, right? And there's an invisible workload that is extremely high. And I would often say to people, I'm not Queen of the Blacks. And more importantly, nobody gave me any land. There's no kingdom. I have no minions. There are no taxes paid to me. So I'm really kind of upset that I'm getting all of this weight of wearing Queen of the Blacks symbolism and none of the benefits, right? And so that's an excellent point, that a lot of times, that's why I said, if you are thinking of a DEI person, please do not just assume that the one Latinx person that you have in your community is going to be that role, or the one Black, or the one person who is, ably challenged or one gay person. So you have to, this has to be something that that person agreed to. And I think that this has to be something that people are compensated for, because this is their time, their energy, and it is a heavy, heavy burden. And a lot of times we don't realize how heavy the burden is because no one was checking in on that burden before. But that doesn't mean that that weight wasn't there being carried. As the only Black professor in the business school, and as one of maybe 5 Black professors in the university, every single day I had students from dentistry to law to pharmacy to art coming to my office to say, Professor, can we talk? I heard about you from another Black student and I want to talk. And so there was an invisible workload that none of my colleagues knew about. And I didn't even talk about, because I also thought it was my role to hear from these students, to help these students. So I think compensation is a critical part of the conversation, because this is a very big load to put on one person. And there's and we can't think, oh, nothing is going on. Something is always going on. And people feel the stress of it, and they want to talk, and they want to relate, and they want to identify with somebody else who's relatable. So I think the compensation piece must be part of the conversation.
And thank you for that. And I think one of the things that's heartening to see within the industry is increasingly we have seen agencies who are explicitly creating roles for DEI, who are creating roles that are specifically focused at addressing these issues. And I think one of the other points that I know that I've heard in conversation with some of my members is oftentimes there is this focus on, well, we do have a compliance person. That person is naturally the right person for this. And I guess the point I would reflect back is the clear message I've received that compliance is not something that is moving the ball forward necessarily. It's just meeting the baseline requirements. So again, appreciate the time. Jackie, do we have any more questions from any audience members?
We don't have any questions yet, but if someone would like to, oh, I have one. Sorry, it just came in. For sound decision-making, there must be diversity of thought and not simply diversity of phenotypes. I guess not really a question, more of a statement. So.
Yeah, and I often get that, and I think that is 100% correct. But I think we often find that when we have a bunch of diverse people in the room, we will naturally get diversity of thought. It doesn't always happen, but it all depends on how we look at diversity, right? Diversity, there's so many groups of that, and I've talked about gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, department, location. I always joke with my Bay Area friends that whenever I say, I'm working in Stockton, people look so apologetic for me. So the idea is that, yes, for sure, these little buckets of diversity that we have come up with do not necessarily indicate diversity of thought, but there is certainly a correlation between groups of diverse people with diversity of thought. And so we are very likely to get diversity of thought as a byproduct when we look at these other groups of diversity. That being said, we can have people who look exactly the same and think very differently at perspectives. But either way, we are still drawn to affinity bias, which means whether you think like me or you look like me or I feel comfortable around you, we are drawn to people who are similar to us. And I am saying from a decision-making standpoint, the data on that is very clear, that when people are very similar to us and we all think alike, then we do not make decisions in the same way as diverse groups. And the results are far more improved when you have diversity of thought, which is often a byproduct of minority groups in the room in diverse pools. So, that is often being said, oh, if we have all these different people and they think the same way, yes, that hypothetically, that seems like a thing that could happen. But often when we have different groups of people, they think in different ways. That's a fact. And I've seen it in my years, different groups of people. Now, That being said, we also have to think about economic diversity. We have to think about schooling diversity, educational diversity. So, job function diversity. We talked about, something as simple as having a driver in the room versus planners in the room. So I'm looking at it from all perspectives, but I appreciate that point of view, and you're absolutely correct that we have to think about diversity of thought as well, for sure.
Thank you. Any other questions, or someone that would like to raise their hand real quick for one or two more questions? We're so lucky to have Dr. Matthews with us here today and next week, so take advantage of it. So we really appreciate your time. But I did have you had alluded to this earlier, and I was wondering, I know that we should probably, like you said, set example, but there is a biases really around the type of riders that use transit, and it's terrible. It's something that we need to overcome. And so how can we do that besides ourselves riding transit? What other kinds of things can we do to change that biases against the outlook of what people look at as transit users?
Well, in transit, we particularly in California, is different than, I take transit a lot when I'm in New York. And so it's a different type of person that is taking public transit. I would say we have maybe 3 buckets of folks that take transit. We have a large low-income at-risk population that are taking transit, right? And in that, there are many different categories of people. And I think a lot of times that a lot of the stereotyping is happening around those groups of riders. We also have a lot of people who are really sensitive about the environment, who consciously choose to take transit. And in that pocket, we have a lot of people who ride bikes and then take transit in between when they're not riding the bikes. And then we have a lot of commuters, right? And even in that, I remember my dad talking about the fact that, he never understood why the commuter lines get benefits, other lines don't. And I think even as we talk about these groups of transit users, we treat the groups differently, often giving commuters benefits. Certainly in the trains, it's a little bit different, right? But in buses, with these express buses that we have, sometimes some of the best buses go to our commuters and so forth. But coming back to your question, it's a chicken and egg, right? Because how can we attract non-traditional riders to use transit? But then if we don't, and that way we would expand our funding sources, of course, because the revenue we would get from the ridership. And at the same time, without having that expansive ridership, we don't have the revenue to do more. So it's a chicken and egg kind of situation that we have. But I think what a lot of agencies are really attempting to do. So currently, almost every single agency in California has some kind of outreach to baby boomers, right? They do things with senior citizens. They have outreach to senior homes and so forth and so on, because everyone recognizes, oh gosh, we gotta get to the seniors. But few agencies have outreach to a lot of our younger potential riders. And can I tell you, this is the first time in the history of the United States where we have so many people between the ages of 16, 17, and maybe even 31 who do not even own a driver's license, right? So we have the potential to get a wide cross-section of riders into our fold, and we're really not actively and aggressively tapping into those. And so some agencies are now making real moves into engaging with younger audiences and trying to kind of actively combat the fear, the misconception, the perceptions around stereotyping of who takes transit and who doesn't, so that we can get people taking the bus and utilizing public transportation from an early age and becoming comfortable in their skin around taking public transportation. And that is a huge part of the fight towards making public transportation more attractive to a wide cross-section of groups. And agencies are doing those in different ways. Some have Mommy and Me initiatives. Some have grade school and high school initiatives. Some have initiatives in the communities where they have worked with different schools and so forth and so on. So I think we have to really be creative and think outside of the bus of how we engage with the public. And then a lot of agencies are doing really creative, exciting things to get people who have never taken the bus to start taking the bus. And whether that is, you know, having a music festival on the bus or a library on the bus or different things where you expose people who don't normally take the bus to taking the bus through a fun activity. And that is going to lessen the fear, lessen the concern, lessen the stereotyping around who takes the bus and who doesn't. And then you also have to think about your employees who do have stereotypes about, you know, drug use and homelessness and all of these different things that people perceive to happen on, and they do happen on the buses for sure. But I think having an understanding that, okay, I may have a bias against those folks is the first step in the right direction. And then being open to having conversations about how that stereotype drives decision is kind of the next step to breaking down the impact of those stereotyping, those perceptions that we have of individuals.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of work to do in this arena, but I'm looking forward to it because I think it creates great equity if we can get everybody to ride the bus. So
yes, I do. I agree completely. One last question. Do we have time for one last question? Let's see. I don't see anything in the chat.
nope, I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. We had so many people who stayed on the call through the end, and I really appreciate that. You know, it's been wonderful spending the last 2 hours with you guys, and I look forward to chatting with you all again next week.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. We'll see you next week. We hope everybody tunes in next week. Michael, any last words?
No, just want to again thank Dr. Sasha for joining us this afternoon. Folks, would strongly encourage that you participate in next week's second part of this webinar series, just because I think it is important for us to continue to have these conversations. And then, as I noted at the very top, while this is one offering that we'll be providing jointly with CalACT, you can expect that moving forward, this is going to be a central part of what we talk about as an industry. I think it's absolutely critical that we start dispelling the biases, the prejudices that have led to inequitable outcomes, particularly when it comes to transit project delivery, the service planning that we have let out with. And I think right now we do have a unique opportunity in that I know that many of you had to scale back your service, a point of necessity during the pandemic. You're now in the process of rebuilding your service. Folks, let's make sure that we're rebuilding better than how we were pre-pandemic. And I think having conversations like this with outside counsel from folks like Dr. Sasha is going to be a critical part in helping to deliver those improved services. So with that, again, just want to thank you for your time again, Dr. Sasha, and folks will talk next week.
Thank you so much. And I just want to let people know today was about unconscious bias and kind of understanding what it is. And next week, we're going to be talking about the role it plays in decision making and our policies, procedures, etc. So I'm looking forward to seeing everyone again, and so great to see those of you who I know before, and so good to meet new folks on the call. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. See everybody next week. Bye.
Bye.